Army Secretary, my brother-in-law Nathan said loudly, lifting his wine glass. That's a fancy way of saying you pushed paperwork for people who actually mattered. The table erupted in laughter. I felt my husband Mark squeeze my arm under the table, not to defend me, to keep me quiet. I lowered my eyes to the old military dog tag resting against my wrist. The engraving was worn, but one line was still clear. Raven 6. Nathan noticed it and smirked. Seriously, you even gave yourself a superhero nickname. More laughter. Then a chair scraped across the floor. An older man from a nearby table stood so suddenly that several people turned to look. His eyes were fixed on my dog tag, and when he spoke, his voice was sharp enough to cut through the entire room. Where did you get that call sign? I'm Emily Carter. I was 39 years old that night, and for most of my adult life, I had learned that people are comfortable with your sacrifices as long as they never have to look directly at them. Before I became Mark's wife, before I became the quiet woman sitting at the end of family dinners, I served 16 years in Army intelligence. Most people imagine military service as uniforms, medals, and dramatic stories. My career looked different. It was long hours, classified reports, deployment schedules, secure communications, and decisions that followed me home long after I left the Army. I rarely talked about any of it, not because I was ashamed, because some memories deserved silence. Mark knew that when we met, in the beginning, he respected it. He said he admired how I never needed attention, how I never introduced myself with my rank or service record. But over the years, something changed. His family treated my military background like a hobby instead of a career. His mother called it my Army phase. His sister once joked that I probably spent most of my time organizing spreadsheets. And Nathan, her husband, was always the worst. Nathan loved being the loudest person in every room. He owned a successful construction company, drove expensive trucks, and measured people's value by how much attention they attracted. My quietness irritated him. The less I talked about myself, the more convinced he became that there was nothing worth talking about. I had spent years letting his comments slide, years listening to jokes about paperwork, years hearing him call me soldier girl, years watching Mark smile awkwardly and tell me afterward he doesn't mean anything by it. But insults grow heavier when nobody challenges them, especially when the person sitting beside you chooses comfort over courage. Before leaving for dinner that evening, I had opened a small wooden box stored in the back of my closet. Inside were several medals, a folded photograph, and the dog tag Nathan had just mocked, Raven 6. For a moment, I had considered leaving it at home. Instead, I slipped it onto my wrist and closed the box. I never imagined someone in that restaurant would recognize it, or that before the night was over, a retired 3-star general would force everyone at that table to see me differently. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller. Every conversation around us seemed to fade as the older man stepped closer to our table. Nathan laughed nervously and raised his hands. "Whoa, sir, it was just a joke." The man ignored him. His eyes never left the dog tag on my wrist. "May I see that?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before unclasping it and handing it over. The instant he turned it over, his expression changed. Not confusion, recognition. The kind that comes from finding something you never expected to see again. Nathan leaned back in his chair and smirked. "What is this secret military club stuff?" A few relatives chuckled. Nobody else did. The older man remained silent for several seconds. Then he looked directly at me. Emily Carter. The room seemed to stop breathing. I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't heard my full name spoken in that tone for years. Yes, sir. His jaw tightened. Across the table, Nathan looked amused. You actually know her. The man slowly turned toward him. Know her. There was something in his voice that made even Nathan sit up straighter. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside me. For the first time all evening, he looked worried. Not about me, about where this conversation might be heading. Nathan still didn't understand. He leaned forward with a grin. Come on, don't tell me she was some kind of action hero. I stared down at my water glass. People often mistake silence for surrender. I learned long ago that explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is usually a waste of breath. The older man carefully placed my dog tag on the table. His fingers lingered on the engraved call sign, Raven 6. Then his eyes returned to Nathan. That isn't a nickname. The smile disappeared from Nathan's face. The room went quiet enough for me to hear the air conditioning overhead. A server carrying drinks slowed her pace. Several nearby tables were now watching. Nathan forced out a laugh. Okay, then what is it? The older man's expression hardened. For a brief second, I saw the same look I remembered from military briefings years ago, the look of someone remembering something painful, something important. Then he straightened his shoulders. My name is Daniel Whitmore, he said. Lieutenant General, United States Army, retired. And suddenly nobody at our table looked at Nathan anymore. They were all staring at me. General Whitmore remained standing. No one spoke. Even Nathan, who always seemed to have another joke ready, suddenly looked unsure of himself. The general turned back to me. Major Emily Carter, he said quietly. Not asked, confirmed. I felt every eye at the table settle on me. Across from me, Sarah blinked twice. My mother-in-law's mouth hung slightly open. Mark stared at the tablecloth. For years, he had heard pieces of my story. For years, he had never wanted to hear all of it. Nathan finally found his voice. Wait, Major. The general didn't look at him. Yes, Major. Nathan laughed awkwardly. Okay, maybe she had a higher rank than I thought. The general's expression hardened. You still don't understand. The room fell silent again. Then he looked toward me, not as someone exposing a secret, as someone asking permission to honor it. I gave a small nod. That was enough. In 2012, he said, there was an operation outside Kandahar. The words instantly pulled me back 14 years. Dust, radio static, fear, the smell of smoke. The convoy was hit during an evacuation mission. He continued. Communications failed. Several teams were separated. People were trapped. Nobody at the table moved. Major Carter was attached to the Intelligence Coordination Cell supporting that operation. Nathan opened his mouth, but the general continued before he could speak. While others were trying to figure out what was happening, she stayed on the radio and rebuilt communications between scattered teams under active fire. I looked down at my hands. I could still remember the voices. Some of them never came home. That was why I rarely spoke about it. Not because I wanted attention, because attention never felt appropriate beside loss. The general's voice softened. Her decisions that night helped bring dozens of people out alive. The restaurant seemed impossibly quiet. A fork slipped from someone's hand at a nearby table. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smiled. Nathan swallowed. So, that's where the call sign came from. General Whitmore slowly nodded. Yes. His eyes locked onto Nathan. Raven 6 wasn't a nickname. He paused. It was the voice people prayed would answer the radio. The air seemed to leave the room. Then the general spoke the sentence that changed everything. Your father was one of the men who came home because she stayed on that line. Nathan stared at General Whitmore as if the words refused to make sense. My father, he asked. The general nodded once. Yes. Nobody moved. The laughter that had filled the table earlier felt like something that had happened years ago. Nathan looked around for support. For the first time all night, he couldn't find any. His wife was staring at me. My mother-in-law looked embarrassed. Several relatives suddenly seemed fascinated by their plates. Still, Nathan made one final attempt. Look, with all due respect, General, maybe you're giving her too much credit. The sentence barely left his mouth before the general reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. A few taps later, he turned the screen toward the table. The image was old. The quality wasn't perfect, but everyone could see it. A military ceremony, several senior officers, and standing near the center was a younger version of me in dress uniform. The room went completely silent. General Whitmore zoomed in. A medal hung from my uniform. Then another and another. Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation medals. Proof that could not be laughed away. I heard someone at the far end of the table inhale sharply. Nathan's face had gone pale. That's really her, yes, the general replied. Major Emily Carter. Nobody laughed. A champagne glass froze halfway to someone's lips. The server who had been walking past our table stopped for a second before continuing. Even the sounds of the restaurant seemed farther away. Then the general delivered the truth none of them were expecting. There's something else you should know. His eyes shifted toward Mark. My husband immediately looked uncomfortable. Years ago, Emily received formal recognition related to that operation. The documentation wasn't secret. The general paused. Your husband already knew. The words landed harder than anything Nathan had said all evening. I slowly turned toward Mark. He lowered his eyes. Sarah looked stunned. What does that mean? She asked. Mark swallowed. His voice barely worked. I found the box. No one spoke. I found her medals, the letters, the service records. I felt something heavier than Nathan's insults settle over the table. Not anger, disappointment. Mark looked at me. I didn't tell anyone. Why, Sarah asked. His answer came out almost as a whisper. Because every time they talked about her, I felt smaller. The room fell silent all over again. I looked at him for several seconds before finally speaking. You didn't have to defend my record. Mark, I kept my voice calm. You only had to defend me. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The silence felt different now, not uncomfortable, honest. Nathan looked down at the table. The man who had spent years making jokes suddenly seemed much smaller than the version of himself he tried so hard to project. Finally, he cleared his throat. Emily. His voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry. No one rushed to rescue him. No one laughed. No one changed the subject. For once, he had to sit inside the consequences of his own words. I thought, he began, then stopped. I thought you wanted people to think you were important. I shook my head. No. The answer came easily. I just wanted to be treated with basic respect. Nathan nodded slowly. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't argue. Across the table, Sarah reached for his hand, not to protect him, to steady him. Then Mark spoke. Emily, please. I looked at him. His eyes were red, not from humiliation, from regret. I should have said something years ago. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, Nathan's insults weren't the deepest wound. Mark's silence was. Every joke had needed an audience. Every insult had needed permission. And every time he told me to let it go, he had quietly granted that permission. "I know," I said. The words were calm, not cold, not angry, just true. Mark lowered his head. "I was afraid." "Of what?" He exhaled. "That people would compare me to you." The honesty surprised even him. I nodded. At least now we were talking about the real problem. General Whitmore stood and gently placed my dog tag back into my hand. His expression carried the quiet respect that exists between people who understand what service costs. "It was an honor seeing you again, Major." I smiled. "Thank you, sir." As he walked away, several people at nearby tables nodded toward me, not because of my medals, not because of my rank, because they finally understood something the people closest to me had missed. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is discipline. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is dignity. I slipped the dog tag into my pocket and stood. Nathan apologized again before I left. This time, I believed he meant it. As for Mark, our conversation would continue long after that dinner ended. But one thing had already changed. I no longer needed anyone's permission to be respected. And for the first time in years, that felt like freedom. If this story touched you, take a moment and think about the times someone underestimated you simply because they never took the time to learn who you really were. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people who should have stood beside us and chose silence instead. I'd love to hear from you. Which moment in this story stayed with you the most? Have you ever experienced a time when someone judged you without knowing your full story? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about dignity, honor, resilience, and quiet justice mean something to you, please like this video and subscribe. We'd be honored to have you join us for the next story. One of the most valuable lessons in life is that your worth is not determined by how loudly others praise you or how unfairly they judge you. Some people will underestimate you because they only see a small part of your story. But real strength comes from knowing who you are, even when no one else does. Dignity isn't about winning every argument. It's about staying true to yourself when respect is not freely given. Never shrink yourself to make others comfortable. The right people will recognize your character in time. If this message spoke to you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories about honor, strength, resilience, and quiet justice.